Imagine stepping onto an alien world where gravity hiccups feel like minor accidents and diplomacy blends wonder with theatricality. Ambassador Sarah Tours faces exactly that as she prepares for first contact with the Zephyrians, a civilization living in crystalline spires amid streams of liquid starlight. Her relatable humor masks high-stakes nerves, and her opening line, "We come in peace," bearing gifts of friendship and hopefully not any infectious diseases, sets the tone for a journey where cross-cultural exchange meets cosmic abs. The Starship Harmony's recycled air tasted faintly of metal and disinfectant, a flavor Sarah Tours had come to recognize as the official taste of deep space. 3 months in transit had smoothed the crisp edges off her diplomatic uniform. The fabric felt less like an emblem of Earth and more like a second skin worn a little too long. She straightened the collar one last time and regarded the sealed box of diplomatic gifts. Handcrafted pottery, historical texts, agricultural seeds, each item carefully vetted, labeled, and approved. Very thoughtful. Very human. Polly, the ship's AI, chimed in with a voice that was patient to the point of condescension. "Ambassador, your draft greeting contains 7 protocol violations. Would you like me to list them?" Sarah ignored the offer. She was busy practicing in the mirror. "We come in peace," she said, then paused. "Too generic." She tried again, leaning into the words. "We bring gifts of friendship." Better. She remembered the briefing files, and hopefully no infectious diseases. She caught her own eye in the reflection and almost laughed. Here she was, light years from anything familiar, rehearsing pleasantries like it was a regional summit back home. The absurdity of it settled in her stomach, a quiet, persistent hum. Polly wasn't done. Statistical models indicate a 42% chance of allergic reaction to Zephyrian atmospheric particles. Would you like mitigation strategies? Sarah shook her head. Humanity had prepared for everything. Simulations, language primers, cultural databases. They'd studied orbital patterns, atmospheric composition, even hypothetical social structures. But standing there with the hum of the ship around her, she wondered if they'd prepared for the feeling. The sheer scale of not knowing, the deck shivered under her feet. Not a violent jolt, just the Harmony correcting its path through a patch of irregular gravity. They called it space turbulence. Felt more like the universe sighing. She took a breath. The final phrasing felt right. Not too formal, not too casual. A little humility went a long way, her trainer used to say, especially when you're the one who might accidentally start an interstellar plague. The ship's alert tone sounded softly. A single chime. No urgency, just notification. Sarah turned from the mirror. Through the main viewport, the starfield shifted. The black softened, bruised with purples and blues. And there it was, Zephira. Not a planet as humans understood it. A cut jewel against velvet. A world that didn't just exist but performed. The Harmony slid smoothly out of warp. The hum of the engine settled into a lower, waiting frequency. Silence filled the cabin, thick and expectant. Sarah's hand went to the box of gifts, pottery, seeds, words of peace. It all felt suddenly small. Very, very small. She squared her shoulders. Time to see if the welcome mat was out. Zephira grew until it filled the viewport, a planet that ignored every law of terrestrial geology Sarah had ever studied. It didn't look like a world. It looked like a master artisan's final project, a fever dream rendered in crystal and impossible light. Spires of what could only be described as diamond, shot through clouds that didn't drift so much as refract, scattering rainbows that had no business existing in vacuum. Polly's voice cut through the silence, all business. Multiple gravitational anomalies detected. Landing trajectory requires constant recalculation. The ship's display lit up with overlapping fields of force, a mess of ripples and eddies in space-time. It looked less like a navigation chart and more like a bad stress diagram. Rivers of what the sensors labeled as liquid photonic matter wound through valleys of fused gemstone. They didn't flow with the lazy grace of water. They moved with purpose like mercury, but shining with a captured stellar glow. Sarah watched one snake through a canyon of emerald and amethyst, and a cold realization settled in her stomach. Their maps were useless. The very ground beneath those impossible structures seemed to shift and reform as she watched, a landscape that refused to hold still long enough to be charted. The Harmony began its descent. The gentle hum of the engines became a series of short corrective bursts. The ship would dip toward the surface, then lurch sideways as another pocket of distorted gravity grabbed it. It felt less like flying and more like being passed between reluctant hands. Sarah's stomach did a slow, uncomfortable roll as the artificial gravity flickered. For a second, she weighed half what she should, then double. Her coffee mug, left on a console, lifted gently, hovered, and slammed back down with a sharp crack. The liquid inside sloshed violently before settling. Very interesting. And deeply unpleasant. She gripped the arms of her chair. The harness felt flimsy. This was worse than turbulence. This was the universe itself seeming to hiccup. Then came a jolt so sudden and violent her teeth snapped together. The harness straps bit into her shoulders. Alarms blared for half a second before Polly silenced them. Localized gravity spike compensating. The viewport was a dizzying swirl of color and light, the ship fighting for a stable path. Then, as if they'd passed through a membrane, the violent shaking ceased. The harmony steadied, gliding smoothly now. They were through the upper atmosphere. The chaotic beauty outside resolved into something even more impossible. Below them, citadels rose from the gemstone plains. But they weren't static structures of stone and metal. They pulsed. Their walls expanded and contracted with a slow rhythmic cadence. Towers unfurled like flowers reaching for the sun, then relaxed. The entire cityscape was breathing. It was architecture as a living organism. Sarah's rehearsed lines, her protocol, her entire mission brief evaporated from her mind. The box of pottery and seeds on the floor seemed laughably quaint. All the simulations, all the expert predictions, all the anxious planning back on Earth, none of it had even come close. They had prepared her for strange. They had not prepared her for this. A quiet, almost reverent thought formed, untainted by diplomacy or duty. Nobody told me it would be this beautiful erdity. The landing ramp of the Harmony hissed open, lowering itself onto a surface that didn't look solid. The ground glowed with a soft internal light like a vast slab of captured moonlight. Sarah took a slow breath, the air tingling in her lungs. It carried a scent somewhere between rain on hot stone and ozone after a lightning strike. Very clean. Very alien. She stepped forward. Her foot sank into the glowing surface. It didn't feel like rock or soil. It gave way with a subtle, spongy resistance. The gravity, which had felt almost normal aboard the ship, was completely different planet-side. It was lighter but somehow less constant, a fluctuating pressure that tugged at her from odd angles. Her ankle twisted. Her balance, so carefully maintained during 3 months of zero-G drills, abandoned her completely. She went down hard on one knee, her hand slapping the surface to break her fall. The impact sent a soft golden ripple spreading out from her palm. The sensation was deeply disorienting. It felt like stepping onto a trampoline during a mild but persistent earthquake, not exactly the graceful entrance she'd pictured. Her Zephyrian escorts were there instantly. They stood a head taller than her, their forms elegant and slender. Their skin had a translucent quality like alabaster lit from within, and across it shimmered intricate, shifting patterns of soft light. Blues and silvers wove together in hypnotic, silent conversations. As she pushed herself up, their long, pointed ears twitched. Not a random gesture. They pivoted toward her with clear intent. She got the distinct, unsettling impression they weren't just listening to her embarrassed apology. They were listening to her heart hammering against her ribs, to the rush of blood in her veins. She was a walking bio-readout, and they were studying the data. Right, the speech. Time to be a diplomat. She straightened her jacket, hoping the motion looked dignified and not like she was trying to hide a stumble. She looked at the nearest escort, whose light patterns were a calm, flowing cyan. On behalf of the people of Earth, she began, her voice thankfully steady. We come in peace. We bring gifts of friendship. She paused, remembering the briefing. And, we have taken every precaution to ensure we do not introduce any harmful microorganisms or infectious diseases to your ecosystem. She held her breath. The Zephyrians regarded her. Their ear twitches slowed. The cool, analytical cyan of their skin patterns warmed, shifting through gentle golds into a rich, welcoming amber. The light seemed to pulse in a slow, rhythmic beat that felt almost approving. One of them made a soft, chiming sound. Not a word. More like a bell struck gently underwater. The amber glow intensified. They weren't offended. They weren't even concerned. They found it charming. Her undignified stumble, her clinical disclaimer, it was all part of the show. A fascinating display of alien awkwardness. The lead escort gestured with a long-fingered hand, not toward her but past her. Sarah turned. The escort was pointing to the nearest of the great breathing citadels. Its walls pulsed in a slow rhythmic expansion and contraction, like the sides of some vast sleeping creature. The tempo of its movement seemed to sync with the warm amber glow on the escort's skin. An invitation. They wanted her to go inside the living city. The entrance to the Zephyrian citadel wasn't an archway. It was a living passage, its sides expanding and contracting like the ribs of some vast slumbering creature. Warm air sighed out with each contraction, carrying a scent like sun-warmed stone. Taking a breath felt less like entering a building and more like being inhaled. Inside, the corridor stretched ahead, its walls smooth and slightly yielding. But as Sarah followed her escorts, she noticed something unsettling. The hallway seemed to narrow almost imperceptibly, the walls drawing in just a fraction. It wasn't a mechanical motion. It felt organic, responsive. Her pulse, still elevated from the stumble outside, kicked up another notch. The walls shifted again. A subtle constriction, a gentle pressure that made her shoulders feel tight. The architecture wasn't just alive. It was listening. It was reading the spike of her anxiety, the shallow rhythm of her breath, and it was responding. A building that got claustrophobic when you did. Very interesting. And deeply uncomfortable. She looked down. With each step, the floor beneath her feet reacted. Where her boot made contact, the soft glow of the surface shifted through a spectrum of colors. A step produced a soft blue circle, another a brief flare of violet. It was like walking on a pond made of liquid light, her movement the only thing disturbing its surface. She tried to step lightly. It didn't help. Her Zephyrian escorts moved ahead, their own steps leaving no such mark, their patterns of inner light remaining a calm, placid silver. They approached a section of the wall that looked no different from any other. It irised open without a sound, not a door swinging on hinges but a membrane retracting, revealing another passage. It sealed shut behind them, seamless once more. The air changed as they moved. One moment it carried the faint, clean scent of ozone. The next, a warmer, almost floral note, then something crisp and sharp like mint. The building wasn't just halls and doors. It was setting a mood, a scent for transit, a scent for contemplation. Sarah forced herself to stop. She closed her eyes for a second, blocking out the impossible breathing architecture. This was a test, not of protocol or speech, but of composure. The building was a giant bioscanner, and her nervous system was feeding it all the wrong data. She took a long, deliberate breath, filling her lungs with the current scent, now something vaguely like sandalwood. She held it, then let it out slowly, consciously willing her shoulders to drop, her heart to slow its frantic rhythm. She thought of quiet things, the deep silence of space from just an hour before. The weight of the gift box in her hands, she opened her eyes. The walls, which had been holding a tense, cool gray, warmed. A soft gold light pulsed through them, spreading from the floor up, a gentle wave of approval. The slight pressure against her sides eased. The hallway seemed to breathe out, widening just enough to feel spacious again. Her escort's ear twitched, and the light patterns on its skin flashed a brief matching gold. It had noticed. They all had. The lead escort gestured forward. The corridor ended not in another irising membrane, but in a vast opening. They stepped through into a chamber so immense it stole the air from Sarah's lungs. The walls curved up and away, and the ceiling wasn't there. It opened directly to the sky, but not the sky of Zephyra as she'd seen it from space. This was a close, swirling tapestry of nebulae and star clusters, constellations unknown to any human map, all rendered in impossible, vivid detail. It was like standing at the bottom of a well that drilled straight through the atmosphere into the heart of the galaxy. The light from above played over the floor, which now swirled with slow cosmic patterns echoing the dance happening light years overhead. The grand assembly hall made the breathing corridors feel simple. It defied perspective, walls curved in ways that hurt the eyes, surfaces meeting at angles that shouldn't exist. It was a space built by minds that didn't think in straight lines or flat planes. The air itself felt thick, textured, like moving through something more substantial than nothing. Hundreds of delegates filled the chamber, but not a single one sat in a chair. They occupied the space in a dozen different ways. A crystalline being hung in a complex geometric pattern, its facets catching the light. A creature of swirling mist and subtle electricity drifted past, leaving a trail of ozone. They floated, they hovered, they simply existed in positions that ignored gravity's usual rules. The seating wasn't just multi-level. It was multi-dimensional. Sarah stopped just inside the entrance, the soles of her boots firmly on the glowing floor. She scanned the impossible room. No benches, no platforms, no designated area for the bipedal and gravity-bound. Her Zephyrian escorts had melted away into the shifting crowd, their forms blending with the other attendees. She was alone, and she was the only one standing on the actual ground. She took a few cautious steps, feeling profoundly solid. A Vorthari delegate hovered nearby, its rocky, multi-limbed form suspended a foot off the floor. It didn't have eyes, but a cluster of light-sensitive nodules oriented toward her. She gave a small, awkward nod. It made a low grinding sound and rotated slowly away. Not exactly a warm welcome. Above her, the representatives of the Nebula Collective drifted like living storm clouds. Their forms shifted from wispy translucence to dense, dark masses. Their conversations a silent exchange of lightning flashes and color shifts within their gaseous bodies. They paid her no mind. She was furniture. Zephyrian attendants moved through the air with a fluid, weightless grace. They didn't walk. They swam through the atmosphere, their limbs pushing against the air as if it were water. They darted between the floating delegates, their bioluminescent patterns flashing quick, efficient messages. They were the stagehands in this theater of the bizarre, and she was an actor who'd forgotten how the stage worked. Then the noise hit. Not sound, but a violent rush of meaning directly into her skull, her translator implant. A sleek little device behind her ear designed for linear audio, short-circuited. It was trying to process 100 different conversations at once, in languages built from scent, light, vibration, and concepts humanity hadn't named. A screech of fractured syntax and garbled imagery flooded her mind. The grinding rock talk of the Vorthari, the scent-based arguments from a floral cluster, the pressurized liquid clicks of an aquatic species. It all became a single, overwhelming wall of static. She winced, pressing a finger to her temple. The implant felt hot. She looked around again, a fresh wave of isolation crashing over her. Every other being in the hall was engaged, communicating, existing in a space designed for them. They floated, they drifted, they hung in the air. She stood, a single, lonely figure anchored to the floor, the only thing in the entire grand, impossible hall that seemed to actually need the ground. A sudden silence fell. It wasn't a cessation of noise. It was a change in the quality of the air. The gentle hum of overlapping communications ceased. The drifting delegates stilled. The very light in the room seemed to dim, pulling focus toward the main entrance. Queen Lyra entered. She didn't walk so much as displace reality around her. There was a gravitational pull to her presence, a subtle bend in the space that made everything in the hall orient toward her. Her skin was a living tapestry of light, patterns flowing across it in complex, beautiful equations. She moved with an impossible grace, her pointed ears held high, taking in the entire assembly without seeming to look at anyone directly. As she ascended to a throne woven from strands of solidified light, a wave of synchronization passed through the chamber. Every bioluminescent pattern on every Zephyrian delegate, every attending servant, every pulsing wall shifted. They all fell into rhythm with the soft, slow pulse of light on their queen's skin. The chaotic, multi-species cacophony of the hall was replaced by a single, silent, unified beat. Queen Lyra's throne wasn't carved or built. It was grown, a complex weave of solidified light strands that pulsed with a soft internal rhythm. As she seated herself, the patterns on her skin shifted. They weren't just decorative. They flowed in intricate, precise sequences that looked less like art and more like advanced mathematics given physical form. Equations made manifest, a language of light and logic that Sarah's eyes could see but her brain couldn't begin to parse. It was a beauty so complex it felt alien on a fundamental level. The entire assembly held its breath. Every delegate synced to the Queen's silent, commanding frequency. Her gaze, cool and assessing, swept the hall. It didn't linger on the floating Vorthari or the drifting Nebula Collective. It passed over her own attendants. It moved with purpose, scanning, searching. Then it stopped. It locked onto the one thing in the entire grand, non-Euclidean hall that was different: the human ambassador. The one person still standing on the floor, Sarah felt the weight of that look. It wasn't hostile. It was analytical, deeply curious. The Queen's pointed ears, delicate and expressive, pivoted forward. They oriented on Sarah with the focus of high-gain antennae. She wasn't just being looked at. She was being studied, read, downloaded. Without breaking eye contact, Queen Lyra raised one hand. Her fingers were long, the skin translucent. She didn't make a grand, sweeping gesture. It was a subtle, almost lazy motion. A flick of her wrist, a slight turn of her palm. A silent command. The effect was immediate. The crowd of floating, hovering, drifting delegates between the Queen and Sarah simply parted. They didn't shuffle aside. They moved with a fluid, practiced grace, creating a perfect, clear corridor through the air. It was like watching water split around a stone. The path led from Sarah's boots on the glowing floor straight to the base of the Lightstrand throne. As the path cleared, the Queen's bioluminescence shifted. The complex mathematical patterns softened. The cool, analytical blues and silvers warmed into a cascade of gold and gentle amber. The light seemed to reach out not with words but with feeling. It projected a clear, unmistakable sense of curiosity. Welcome. An invitation. Sarah stood frozen. Her diplomatic training covered a lot of ground. Bowing protocols, gift-giving ceremonies, formal address. It did not cover what to do when a galactic empress carves a path through a multi-species assembly, using a flick of her wrist. Every protocol screamed that this was wrong, that an ambassador did not approach a sovereign unsummoned, that she should wait for a formal escort, a declared invitation. But the Queen wasn't using formality. She was using light, and that light was saying, "Come here." She took a hesitant step forward. Then another. The delegates lining the path watched her, their own light patterns a chaotic mix of colors. Some glowed with the same warm gold as the Queen. Others flashed with what looked like surprise. A few held a cooler, more reserved silver. The silence in the hall was absolute. No grinding rocks, no electric crackles. Just the soft, almost subliminal hum of the breathing walls. She was halfway down the cleared path when Queen Lyra spoke. Her voice didn't echo. It seemed to form directly in the air. A clear melodic tone that wrapped around the words without obscuring them. There was no translator lag, no static. Just a simple, direct question that cut through the silence and every shred of diplomatic protocol Sarah had ever learned. "Will you sit beside me?" The reaction in the hall was instantaneous. The collective bioluminescence of every Zephyrian delegate, attendant, and even the walls themselves flared in a brilliant, unified burst of white light. It was a visual gasp, a silent, shocked exhalation of pure surprise that lit up the entire impossible chamber, before settling back into a chaotic, shimmering ripple of color. The invitation wasn't just unexpected. It was apparently unprecedented. Sarah walked the final steps toward the dais, her eyes scanning the space around the throne. The polished, glowing floor gave way to a raised platform. The step up was high, unnaturally high, as if designed for limbs longer than a human's. She stopped at the base, the gesture of sitting beside a throne suddenly feeling incredibly literal and incredibly awkward. There were no steps, no ramp, just a smooth, vertical face of crystal that rose to the platform's edge, a physical barrier to match the social one. She looked from the Queen's serene face back down to the impossible step. Protocol was out the window, but decorum still had its hooks in her. She couldn't just stand there. The invitation had been given. The path was clear. The entire assembly was watching, their collective light holding a shimmering, expectant pause. So she did the only thing she could think to do. She tried to climb. It was not a graceful maneuver. She placed her hands on the smooth ledge, the material cool and slightly slick under her palms. She got one foot up, her boots scrambling for purchase on the featureless surface, her uniform, already rumpled from the journey, pulled tight across her shoulders. She was essentially attempting to vault onto a stage in front of the most powerful beings she'd ever encountered. Very interesting. And deeply humiliating. Queen Lyra watched for a moment, her head tilted. The intricate light patterns on her skin flowed in a slow, unreadable loop. Then she moved. There was no warning. 1 second she was seated, a picture of regal stillness. The next she leaned forward with a speed that defied her elegant poise. It was the sudden, fluid motion of a predator, but without any threat. Just pure efficient action. Her hand shot out. Cool, translucent fingers closed around Sarah's wrist, just above the scrambling hand. The contact was a shock, not painful. Just absolute. The Queen's skin was smooth, cooler than the air, and it carried a faint, tangible energy, a silent hum. Where their skin met, light erupted, not from the Queen alone. A cascade of shimmering gold patterns raced up Sarah's arm, flowing under the sleeve of her uniform. Simultaneously, a ripple of soft blue, the blue of Earth's sky, traveled from Sarah's wrist up the Queen's arm. The exchange was instantaneous. A two-way street of light and sensation. It felt like a static charge, but warmer, more meaningful. The Queen's grip wasn't forceful. It was an anchor, a point of absolute stability. Through that simple touch, a wave of pure assurance flowed into Sarah. It bypassed her ears, her brain, her translator. It went straight to the core of her, a feeling as clear as if it had been shouted. Stop struggling. I have you. This is right. The scrambling stopped. Sarah went still, her breathing evening out. The frantic energy drained from her limbs, replaced by a strange, borrowed calm. Queen Lyra's light patterns softened from complex equations back to that warm, welcoming gold. She didn't pull Sarah up. She simply held her wrist, a silent guide. With her other hand, the Queen gestured to the empty space on the platform beside her throne. As her fingers moved, the very air seemed to coalesce. Particles of light drew together, weaving and solidifying. In seconds, a new seat formed from the same crystalline substance as the dais. It wasn't a replica of the intricate light throne. It was simpler, solid, stable, and perfectly human-sized. Lyra released her wrist. The shimmering patterns on both their arms faded, leaving only the memory of the connection. She gestured to the new seat. Sarah didn't need to climb. The platform seemed to lower just enough, or the step shrunk, she couldn't tell which. She simply stepped up and sat. The crystal seat was firm, comfortably shaped. It felt made for her. Queen Lyra turned her gaze back to the stunned assembly, her voice clear and carrying. You are the one sitting beside my throne. The silence in the hall broke. The collective bioluminescence of the Zephyrians, which had been a tense, held breath of light, erupted. It wasn't the shocked white flare of before. It was a brilliant, sustained display of approval. Golds, ambers, and warm silvers washed through the chamber in a synchronized wave. The delegates' light patterns, which had been a chaotic mix of surprise and reservation, now pulsed in a harmonious rhythm. The breaking of protocol wasn't a mistake. It was a new precedent, and they were all for it. Sitting beside the throne, Sarah watched the assembly resume its silent, shimmering conversations. Delegates communicated in flares of light and shifting colors, a beautiful, chaotic light show. Then it clicked. It wasn't just decoration. It wasn't a side effect of their biology. This was the language, the real conversation. Her implanted translator, designed for sound waves and syntax, produced only faint, confused whispers in her mind. It could pick up the Vorthari's grinding rocks just fine. It was useless against a conversation made of color and pulse. She was watching a symphony and only hearing the occasional, out-of-context note. She was missing everything. The warm gold that had washed over the Zephyrians when she'd sat down. That wasn't just approval. It had layers. A core of genuine welcome edged with curiosity, and a subtle thread of amusement at the entire situation. Her translator hadn't caught any of that. It just registered positive ambient noise. She was reading the captions while everyone else was watching the movie. Queen Lyra, sensing her frustration without needing to look, spoke softly. Her voice was a calm counterpoint to the visual storm. Your device listens for sound. We speak with light. She held up her own hand, and the skin there glowed a soft, steady blue. This color represents concepts of stability, structure, law. A family of ideas. The blue shifted to a deep green. This is growth, biology, life. Each hue was a category, a conceptual umbrella under which thousands of specific meanings could gather. She then made the green light pulse. First, a slow, steady rhythm. This is contemplation, a statement of fact. The pulses quickened, becoming a rapid, urgent flicker. This is a warning, a call to immediate action. The frequency wasn't just decoration, it was punctuation. It was tone of voice. It told you if a statement was a casual observation or a scream for help. The patterns themselves held the grammar. A simple single-color wash was a basic concept, a greeting, an agreement. But as the patterns grew more complex, weaving multiple colors together in intricate, overlapping sequences, the sentence grew more complex. A proposal, a philosophical argument, a detailed technical explanation, it was all there in the weaving of the light. Some species in the hall, she noted, reacted to these patterns with subtle shifts she couldn't interpret. Their perception was different. They saw more. They could likely perceive depth in the light, or shifts in a spectrum invisible to human eyes. They were reading a full three-dimensional document while she was looking at a flat picture. All this time she'd been staring at the Zephyrians, thinking their natural state was just profoundly beautiful. And it was, but it was like admiring the cover of a book in a language she couldn't read. The beauty was just the surface. The real substance, the meaning, was locked away, filtered through human eyes that simply weren't built to see it. Lyra watched her process this, the patterns on her own skin holding a patient waiting gold. "There is another way," she said. Her tone was matter-of-fact, not pushy. "A biosonance matrix. It would integrate with your neural pathways. It does not translate the light into your words. It allows you to experience the light as we do, to feel the concepts, to hear the emotional resonance behind the patterns." She paused, letting the weight of the offer settle. It wasn't a translator upgrade. It was a sensory overhaul, a new way of perceiving reality itself. The procedure would effectively let Sarah hear the light, not as a sound but as a direct stream of meaning and emotion, bypassing her eyes and ears entirely, and going straight to the understanding parts of her brain. It would turn the beautiful silent movie into a conversation she could finally participate in. The Zephyrian healers led Sarah to a smaller chamber adjacent to the grand hall. The room was round, its walls a soft, steady blue. It felt calm, quiet, very different from the buzzing energy of the assembly. Two of the healers, their skin patterns a soothing, pulsing silver, gestured for her to sit on a smooth central dais that looked grown rather than built. They explained the procedure with a series of simple, clear light patterns that her standard translator could just about manage. It would be a neural integration. The biosonance matrix would interface directly with her existing translation implant, a non-invasive tuning of her nervous system. The whole thing sounded clean, technical. They described it as opening a new channel of perception, but one detail made Sarah's stomach tighten. This wasn't a one-way receiver, it was a transceiver. It translated incoming emotional and conceptual data into something her brain could understand. But it also worked the other way. It could translate her own emotions, her thoughts, into outgoing light patterns. Her private internal monologue, the quiet, unedited stuff that never leaves a person's head, could theoretically become public spectacle. A broadcast. She looked at Queen Lyra, who had followed them into the chamber. "My thoughts. They wouldn't be on display for everyone, would they?" The idea was chilling. Diplomacy required a filter, a polished exterior, the ability to think, "This is a disaster," while saying, "What an interesting proposal." Lyra's patterns shifted to a reassuring, steady gold. "Transmission is voluntary," she said, her voice calm. "The matrix only receives unless you consciously direct it to send. It is a tool for listening first. You would have to choose to project, to shape a feeling into light and push it out. Your private mind remains your own." The silence in the room felt heavy. The healers watched her, their silver patterns holding a patient waiting quality. They weren't pushing. The choice was stark. She could walk away, continue as she was, observing the beautiful silent movie of Zephyrian society from the outside, relying on a flawed translator and her own guesses. She'd be a diplomat who couldn't understand half of what was being said. Or she could say yes. She could step into the current. The diplomatic advantage was obvious. To actually understand the emotional context of a negotiation, to feel the subtle shifts in intent, the unspoken reservations, the genuine enthusiasm hidden behind a neutral proposal. It was more than an advantage. It was the entire point of her being here. She hadn't traveled 3 months through deep space to exchange carefully vetted words. Her mission was to build a bridge. You can't build a bridge if you can't understand the ground on the other side. She thought of her stumble on the landing field, how the Zephyrians had found it charming. They valued authenticity. Perhaps a little transparency wasn't the weakness she feared it was. Perhaps it was the foundation. She looked from the hesitant healers to the Empress. Her own fear was a cold knot in her chest, but beneath it was a sharper, stronger curiosity. A need to know, to really know. "I accept the risk," she said. The words came out clearer than she felt. The healer's silver patterns flashed a brief, bright approval. They moved to either side of the dais. The room itself seemed to respond. The soft blue glow of the walls deepened and a low, resonant hum filled the air, the sound of technology powering up, ancient and advanced at once. It wasn't a mechanical noise. It felt organic, like the room itself was taking a deep, preparing breath. The dais beneath her grew subtly warmer. The procedure was beginning. The humming in the room faded. For a moment, nothing. Then colors bloomed at the edges of Sarah's vision. Not as something she saw. They bypassed her eyes entirely, blossoming directly in her mind. A swirl of deep violet, soft at first, then sharpening. It felt like anxiety, not the thought of it. The raw sensation itself given form. A cool blue spiral followed. A gentle, calming presence that she instinctively knew came from the healers. They were no longer just making patterns on their skin. They were projecting emotions, and she was feeling them. Her brain was tuning into radio stations she never knew existed. She tried to focus, to make sense of the new input, but her own nervousness spiked. A fresh, sharp wave of magenta shot through her perception, this one laced with a frantic, jagged energy. It was her own. A spike of pure fear. What if this thing is leaking my thoughts right now? The thought wasn't a sentence. It was the magenta spike itself, a burst of pure, unedited panic broadcast directly from her mind into the room. She flinched, mortified. Her first act with this new sense was to scream emotionally in a room full of professionals. The healers didn't react with alarm. Their cool blue patterns shifted, softened, and washed over her jagged magenta. The sensation was immediate, a wave of profound reassurance. It felt like a calm hand on a fevered brow. It wasn't words telling her it was okay. It was the feeling of okayness itself, poured directly into her consciousness, the sharp edges of her fear smoothed out, the color fading to a manageable hum. Then something else cut through, a distinct separate presence. It felt like warm gold, solid, unshakable. It held a complex mix of patience, curiosity, and a subtle, ancient amusement. Lyra. Her mind was in the room too, a quiet, steady anchor point in the swirling sea of new sensations. The Empress wasn't speaking. She was just being, and her simple presence was a guide. Sarah took a breath, mentally reaching for the warm gold. She tried to shape a thought. Not a sentence. A concept. She focused on the feeling the healers had given her. That sense of calm, grateful relief. She tried to push it back, to give it form. It was like trying to flex a muscle she'd never used before. She fumbled, and a muddy, brownish-orange splotch flickered in her mind. Frustration. She tried again, pushing past the mental block, focusing on the pure, clean feeling of thanks. A clean, bright yellow light bloomed in her perception. It was shaped like sunlight breaking through clouds, simple, clear, unmistakable. Gratitude. She'd done it. She hadn't spoken a word. She'd transmitted a feeling, a perfect understood feeling. From the healers and then from Lyra's warm gold presence came a response. A ripple of soft, approving silver. It washed through her mind, a cool, pleased sensation that felt like a nod. A smile, a job well done. They'd felt it. They'd understood it perfectly. In that moment, everything shifted. All the carefully drafted speeches, the rehearsed lines, the agonizing over the perfect diplomatic phrasing. It all suddenly felt incredibly clumsy. Verbal language was a crude, blunt instrument. It was trying to describe a symphony by listing the instruments. This was the symphony itself. Diplomacy wasn't about debating points across a table anymore. It was about feeling the emotional currents in a room and learning the steps to a new dance. The mood in the grand assembly shifted from ceremonial to practical. The warm glows of welcome tightened into the sharper, focused patterns of business. The topic was interdimensional resources, specifically temporal asteroids, rocks that didn't stay in one dimension long enough to be easily owned. It was the kind of problem that made terrestrial property law look like a child's game. The Vorthari delegate, its crystalline form emitting a low, resonant hum, projected a claim in sharp, proprietary angles of crimson light. It wanted exclusive mining rights. The patterns carried the weight of legal precedent and a deep, territorial certainty. They could detect the subtle temporal fluctuations of these asteroids, finding them where others saw only empty space. To them, it was a simple case of finders keepers. This was immediately met by a response from the Nebula Collective. Their gaseous form swirled into a complex indigo vortex. Their claim was different. It wasn't based on detection but on history. Ancestral harvesting privileges. Their patterns carried the soft, persistent pressure of tradition, a right earned through generations of careful extraction. They could harvest the unstable minerals without damaging the delicate dimensional membranes around them. a skill no one else possessed. Two completely valid, completely incompatible arguments, grounded in entirely different concepts of ownership. Sarah watched the exchange not just with her eyes, but with her new sense. She felt the Vorthari's rigid, logical certainty, a structure as hard and clear as crystal. She felt the Nebula Collective's deep, fluid connection to the past, a current of tradition as real as any law. The conflict wasn't in the words. It was in these clashing emotional and conceptual foundations. They were arguing from different dictionaries. She stood, and the attention of the hall turned to her, a mix of curious silver and wary green patterns flickering through the assembly. Her mind, humming with the biosonance matrix, didn't form a speech. It assembled a proposal based on what she felt. The problem wasn't ownership. It was capability. The solution wasn't division. It was coordination. She began to shape the idea into light, pushing it out carefully. She used the Vorthari's own crimson, but softened its jagged edges into a pattern of detection and mapping. She wove in the Nebula Collective's indigo, shaping it into the act of gentle harvest. She painted a picture not of a mind to be owned, but of a process to be shared. The Vorthari, with their unique senses, would be the scouts. They would find the asteroids and chart their unstable paths. The Nebula Collective, with their non-invasive techniques, would be the harvesters. They would extract the resources without harm. Then she expanded the idea, pulling in the other species watching the debate. A fleet-based culture could provide transportation through the tricky dimensional eddies. Another species, experts in material refinement, could process the raw ore. She wasn't dividing a pie. She was organizing a kitchen, assigning tasks based on who was best with the knife, the oven, or the recipe. The resolution was a system, not a treaty, a cosmic notification network. When a Vorthari scout located a temporal asteroid, it would broadcast the coordinates and stability data to the network. The Nebula Collective would acknowledge and harvest. The transporters would be dispatched. The refiners would be put on standby. It was a relay race, not a land grab. For a moment, the hall was silent. The only movement, the slow drift of delegates processing the concept. Then the walls themselves reacted. The entire chamber, the living, breathing architecture of the Citadel, flashed a brilliant, unanimous gold. It was a wave of pure approval that washed over everyone. A physical endorsement from the planet itself. The cooperative model wasn't just accepted. It was celebrated. The rigid crimson and defensive indigo that had started the debate melted away, replaced by a complex, interwoven tapestry of light where every color had its place and its purpose. Three species were facing off over a patch of space that physics textbooks would call a printing error. It was a border region where gravity got confused and dimensions overlapped in ways that broke local laws of nature. The Vorthari claimed it for its unique crystalline formations, essential to their singing ceremonies. The Nebula Collective declared it a sacred breeding ground, the unstable physics crucial to their reproductive cycles. Humans, having stumbled into the mess with a poorly placed research station, were caught in the middle. Each side had drawn its line. Military ships from all three now hung in the void around the anomaly, their positions a silent, tense standoff. The light patterns in the Grand Assembly were sharp, hostile reds and defensive, spiked purples. It was the kind of situation that usually ended with someone shooting first and writing a report later. Sarah watched the displays, but she was also feeling the conflict. Through her biosonance matrix, the dispute wasn't about lines on a map. It was a clash of rigid territorial crimson from the Vorthari against the deep protective indigo of the Nebula Collective, with humanity's nervous orange flickering between them. The emotions were so strong they almost had a taste, metallic, bitter. She closed her eyes, letting the data from the anomalous region flow into her enhanced perception. The readings weren't just numbers. They were a symphony of broken rules, a place where science itself had questions, not answers. She stood up. The hostile light patterns in the room focused on her. A collective glare. She ignored them, turning to the main display. "We're looking at this wrong," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't a border. It's a question. The most interesting scientific question any of us has ever seen." She began to shape the idea into light, pushing it out for the assembly to feel, not just hear. She painted a picture not of a territory to be claimed, but of a laboratory to be built, a joint research facility, right there in the chaotic heart of the anomaly, a place to study the dimensional harmonics, to understand why physics broke down there and what that could teach everyone. The proposal landed in the silent hall. The sharp reds and purples didn't vanish, but they softened, mixed with curious silver. She pushed further. The conflict itself was data. The Vorthari crystal singing that disturbed the nebula breeding cycles. That was a measurable interaction between harmonic resonance and a dimensional stability. The human presence that everyone found disruptive? A control group. A baseline of how standard physics reacted to the area. Every point of friction was a potential research paper. The former adversaries began to lean in. Their light patterns shifted from defense to consideration. The Vorthari delegate emitted a complex pattern, detailing their expertise in resonant frequency mapping. The Nebula Collective responded with a flowing design explaining their innate understanding of multidimensional biology. A species that had been quietly observing offered their ships as stable research platforms, capable of anchoring in the unstable gravity. The hostile standoff was dissolving, replaced by a quiet hum of professional interest. They were no longer soldiers guarding a line. They were specialists comparing notes. The resolution wrote itself. The Tri-Species Peace Accord wasn't a treaty dividing land. It was a research charter, a blueprint for cooperation built entirely around shared scientific curiosity. It outlined data-sharing protocols, joint funding for the facility, and rotating research teams from all three species. The military ships weren't sent away. They were reassigned. Their new job was to protect the scientists and the priceless, strange phenomenon they were studying. Queen Lyra had watched the entire exchange from her throne, her patterns a calm, observant gold. As the accord was formally acknowledged by the assembly, her light shifted. The gold deepened, warmed, and swirled with patterns of profound pride. It wasn't pride in victory or territory. It was pride in the reframing. The conflict hadn't been won. It had been made irrelevant, replaced by a question that was so much more interesting than any answer a war could provide. Queen Lyra's offer arrived not in a formal address, but during a quiet moment on a crystalline balcony overlooking the breathing city. The air smelled of night-blooming flowers and cool stone. "The work you have begun requires permanence," she said, her voice as calm as the steady pulse of light on her skin. "I would offer you a formal role, intercultural mediator, a permanent voice for understanding." The words hung there, simple and immense. The setup was straightforward, but the details were not. This wasn't a job title. It was a bonding, a linking of her life to the noble lineages of Zephyra, an adoption into the royal bloodline, an honor traditionally reserved for their own. It would make her family. The gravity of that was one thing. The biological cost was another. The tension was in the fine print. The bonding required irreversible physiological changes. Her human body, so fragile in this galaxy, would be altered at a cellular level. She would gain the ability to survive in environments that would kill an ordinary human. Different atmospheric pressures, toxic air, extreme temperatures. Her consciousness would be permanently embedded in the Zephyrian telepathic networks, a constant low-level connection to thousands of minds. She would become, for all functional purposes, half human, half Zephyrian. There was no going back. She would never again be just Sarah Tours from Earth. The ceremony itself was a process of synchronization. It would take place in the heart of the Citadel, tuned to the precise resonant frequency of the planet's core. Her cells would be harmonized with the very rhythms of Zephyra, with the frequencies that connected every Zephyrian noble. It was less a ritual and more a recalibration of her entire being. In the grand assembly, transformed for the occasion into a chamber of soft, focused light, Queen Lyra stood before her. The assembly was silent, every delegate a witness. Lyra's skin glowed with the complex, beautiful patterns of her lineage. She looked at Sarah, her expression serious, her pointed ears angled forward in absolute focus. "Sarah Tours of Earth," she said, and her voice carried through the silent hall without effort. "Do you accept this bond? Do you accept the duties of this role, the connection to our line and the changes it will bring to your form and mind? Do you accept this with all its responsibilities?" Sarah looked out at the assembly. She saw the Vorthari delegate, its crystalline form reflecting the solemn light. She saw the swirling mist of the Nebula Collective holding a stable, watching pattern. She saw the Zephyrians, their light a tapestry of hope and anticipation. She thought of her old life of starship food and diplomatic manuals. It felt a lifetime away. She didn't speak. She closed her eyes and reached for the biosonance matrix, for the new sense that had become as natural as sight. She shaped her answer not with sound but with pure intent. She formed a clean, brilliant sphere of white light in her mind, imbuing it with every ounce of her certainty, her gratitude, her commitment. She pushed it out, a silent, powerful transmission. The sphere of light bloomed in the air between her and the Queen, visible to everyone in the hall. It held no doubt, no hesitation, only a perfect radiating yes. Then and only then did she open her eyes and speak the word aloud, her voice clear and steady in the humming silence. I accept. The assembly's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Not a roar, but a silent explosion of light. Every Zephyrian in the chamber, every attendant, every noble, and even the pulsing walls of the citadel itself, flashed in a unified, brilliant gold. The light didn't just flash. It held, sustaining a warm, radiant glow that filled the vast space. It was a visual embrace, a collective, silent welcome. They weren't just approving her decision, they were welcoming her home. The light spoke what words could not. She belonged. Sarah stood before a holographic model of her new project. The Galactic Mediation Center was not meant to look like it belonged to any one world. Its design was a careful, sometimes contentious fusion of elements from 12 different civilizations. The result was a structure that looked like a collaborative art project, built by architects who respected each other but had very different tastes. Spires reminiscent of Zephyra's crystalline growths rose next to the solid geometric blocks favored by the Vorthari. Flowing organic arches, a contribution from an aquatic species, curved around the harsh angular landing pads designed by a race of mechanical beings. It was a lot to look at. Very interesting. And to some deeply worrying, the tension wasn't about the aesthetics. It was about philosophy. Delegates from several species voiced a quiet but firm concern. By blending everything together, were they losing what made each culture distinct? Was this new, sanitized, cooperative architecture just a different kind of uniform, forcing everyone into a single, bland style of interaction? They feared their unique ways of debate, their traditional settings for negotiation would be smoothed over and forgotten. A one-size-fits-all solution that fit no one perfectly. Sarah listened, her biosonance matrix picking up the subtle hues of their anxiety. She didn't argue for homogeneity. She argued for a translator. The center's core was the harmony chamber, a room designed not for perfect understanding but for better confusion. It couldn't make a Vorthari's grinding rock talk sound like a Zephyrian's light patterns. Instead, it translated incompatible expressions into a neutral, sensory medium. A heated argument might manifest as a complex but contained light show on the walls, letting everyone see the emotional temperature without being scorched by untranslatable words. The goal was never to eliminate misunderstanding. It was to become really good at working with it. Her motto, printed on a simple placard by the entrance, was, "Productive confusion leads to better solutions." It was a hard sell for diplomats trained to seek clarity and absolute agreements. But Sarah insisted the friction was the point. The best ideas often came from working through the messy parts. To help with the mess, the center included specialized rooms. Emotion amplification chambers allowed participants to momentarily feel the emotional state of their counterparts. It was a brutal, effective tool for empathy. You couldn't dismiss a delegate's position as irrational after you'd felt their species' deep, biological fear of enclosed spaces as your own claustrophobia. Other rooms dealt with time. Time dilation chambers let species with radically different cognitive speeds negotiate comfortably. A being that processed information 100 times faster than a human could enter a chamber where time subjectively slowed, allowing for a real-time conversation without impatient tapping of claws or tentacles. It was a practical solution to a fundamental problem. When the center finally opened, it didn't look like a government building. It looked like a living museum of possibility, and it quickly became a pilgrimage site. Aspiring diplomats from across the galaxy traveled there, not to learn rigid protocols but to learn how to sit with the unknown. They were a strange, brilliant, often baffled group of students from dozens of species. They struggled with the concepts, fumbled through exercises, and regularly created glorious, hilarious miscommunications. They embraced the center's philosophy so thoroughly that they gave themselves a name. They called themselves Sarah's Uncertain Children. It wasn't an insult. It was a badge of honor. They were the first to be taught that not knowing was not a failure, but the first step toward a better answer. Sarah discovered that a well-timed joke worked better than a perfectly worded treaty. Her self-deprecating stories from first contact became her favorite teaching tools at the new mediation center. She'd describe her clumsy stumble onto Zephyrian soil, how it felt like stepping onto a trampoline during an earthquake. She'd point to a faint stain on her uniform and joke it was a map of Orion, a permanent souvenir from a zero-G coffee incident. These small human moments did something remarkable. They translated, but humor wasn't a universal constant. Some species found it baffling. A joke about paperwork to a bureaucratic race of silicon-based life forms resulted in a 3-hour lecture on proper filing systems. A playful tease to a particularly solemn delegate from a low-gravity world was met with a pattern of deep, offended violet. They took the words at face value, missing the emotional context entirely. Comedy, it turned out, was a minefield. You had to know your audience. She realized she couldn't rely on words alone. Using her biosonance matrix, she learned to shape the feeling of amusement into a specific projected light pattern. It was a soft, bubbling gold laced with silver ripples. She wasn't telling a joke. She was transmitting the emotional payload of one. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Delegates who didn't understand the words would still feel the intended lightness, the shared warmth of the moment. Their own patterns would shift, often without them realizing why, from tense reds to curious open gold. This shared laughter, this sympathetic resonance of light, became a new bonding ritual. It cut through formalities and cultural barriers. You might not understand another species' history or politics, but you could feel the same humorous spark. Even the serious Vorthari, with their crystalline forms and rigid logic, weren't immune. Their usual low resonant hum would occasionally shift, punctuated by a brief sharp crackle, their version of a chuckle. It was a small sound, but in a quiet room it was a minor victory. Sarah and her students began using humor as an early warning system. They watched the emotional light patterns in a negotiation. When the colors started to spike into dissonant, hostile reds and jagged purples, when the room's frequency felt like an impending storm, that was the signal. Someone would deliberately introduce a humorous concept. A delegate might project the bubbling gold-silver pattern. Someone else might tell a short, self-deprecating anecdote. The shift was often instant. The tense patterns would soften, the emotional temperature of the room would drop, and the negotiation could reboot from a less hostile place. A joke became a circuit breaker. The Academy of Interspecies Understanding took official notice. They established a new field of study, comic resonance. They analyzed the specific light frequencies and emotional signatures most effective at diffusing tension and building rapport across different physiologies and cultures. They studied why some concepts translated and others fell flat. Humor was no longer just a personality trait. It was a quantifiable, teachable diplomatic tool, and the example they kept coming back to, the one they used in all their introductory classes, was Sarah's very first attempt. That clumsy, nervous line delivered on a glowing alien field. "We come in peace, bearing gifts of friendship and hopefully not any infectious diseases." It was legendary, not because the words were funny, but because the intention behind them, the vulnerability, the self-awareness, the hope, transcended language. It was the perfect case study. It proved that sometimes the most advanced communication technology in the galaxy was a willingness to laugh at yourself. 2 years later, they stood together on the highest observation deck of the breathing citadel. Ships from dozens of species crisscrossed the jeweled sky. Vorthari crystal cutters, Nebula collective mist frigates, blocky human transports. The traffic was constant. A busy day at the crossroads of known space. Sarah watched them, her hand resting on the warm, pulsing railing. Her human body was still a work in progress. A thin, nearly invisible environmental shield shimmered around her on a low setting, filtering out particulates that would irritate her lungs. A small, necessary concession to biology. The Zephyrian atmosphere was clean, but it wasn't built for human respiration long-term. A minor detail. Her biosonance matrix felt like breathing now. She didn't think about using it. It was just there, a quiet hum in the back of her mind, translating the emotional weather of the world around her. She'd find herself mediating a trade dispute between two species, and realize halfway through she wasn't consciously parsing their words or light patterns. She was just feeling the shape of the conflict and offering a solution. It was like having a conversation without remembering how you learned the language. The knowledge was just in her hands. Lyra consulted her on everything now, not just matters involving humanity, a territorial dispute between two aquatic species over a geothermal vent, a debate on the ethical implications of a new faster-than-light technology. Sarah's perspective wasn't human anymore. It was something else. Their connection allowed for an instant cross-species viewpoint. Lyra would present a problem and Sarah would feel the various angles of it. The Vorthari need for structure, the Nebula Collective's fluid logic, the very human tendency to find a messy compromise. Sometimes the blending went a little too far. She'd have a memory of watching Zephyrian nebulae as a child, the colors more vivid than anything on Earth, and it would take her a second to remember that wasn't her childhood. The line between her memories and Lyra's had grown soft, a shared library of experiences they both drew from. They were planning their next move. Not a diplomatic mission, an exploration, a joint venture into an uncharted dimensional fold that had just been discovered on the edge of Coalition space. The preliminary scans showed physics that made Zephyra look normal. It was the next question, the next great confusion to walk into together. The Empress and the Ambassador no longer held separate meetings. When a delegate came to them with a problem, they responded with a single, unified perspective. They'd start and finish each other's thoughts, their light patterns and spoken words weaving together so seamlessly it was impossible to tell where one mind ended and the other began. They spoke as a single diplomatic unit, a two-person summit that never adjourned. It was efficient. It was also, for anyone watching, a little unnerving. They weren't just partners. They were a closed loop, a perfect circuit of shared understanding, standing side by side and watching their strange, complicated galaxy go about its business. Sarah's methods didn't just get a footnote in the diplomatic manuals. They became the manual. Across the galaxy, first contact teams and treaty negotiators started embracing uncertainty as a core professional skill. The goal shifted from eliminating confusion to navigating it with some degree of grace. It was a hard sell for the old guard. Traditionalists, especially from species with millennia of established protocol, pushed back hard against what they called human-influenced spontaneity. They saw it as messy, undignified, a dangerous erosion of tried-and-true formalities that had kept the peace, however coldly, for centuries. Debates in senates and councils often featured sharp, traditional crimson light patterns clashing against the newer, adaptive golds and silvers. Her students, the ones who had trained at the center and called themselves her uncertain children, were the ones leading the charge into the unknown. They headed out on missions to make first contact with new species, their ships stocked not just with translation databases, but with modified biosonance units. These weren't the full neural integration Sarah had undergone. They were tools, worn on the wrist or draped over the shoulder, designed to pick up on basic emotional frequencies and project simple calming patterns. Empathy enhancers. They let a diplomat feel the mood of a room full of aliens before a single word was officially translated. It was a huge advantage. They also carried a new tradition. Sarah's awkward, hastily added line about infectious diseases had undergone a strange transformation. It shed its practical purpose and became ceremony. Diplomats now used it as a formal opening phrase across the galaxy. It wasn't about germ theory anymore. It was a statement of intent, a humble admission that you came from a different world, with different biology and different ideas, and that your very presence might cause unintended problems. It meant, we know we might mess this up, but we mean well. It set the tone for the entire interaction. When a new recruit at the academy struggled, fumbling with a biosonance unit, or freezing during a simulated negotiation with a hostile gas-based entity, the instructors had a standard piece of advice. Remember Sarah's stumble? It wasn't a story about failure. It was a lesson in recovery. Her trip onto the glowing Zephyrian soil was taught as the crucial first step, the moment a perfect plan met messy reality, and the diplomat chose to get up and keep going. That initial anxiety, that fear of looking foolish was reframed. It wasn't a weakness to be hidden. It was a necessary skill, a sign you were paying attention. This philosophy even shaped the buildings. New mediation centers and embassies inspired by Sarah's original designs incorporated deliberate uncertainty features, hallways that gently changed their acoustics based on the tension level of conversations inside. Rooms where the ambient light would subtly shift to a calming blue if negotiations grew too heated. The architecture itself was built to be a participant, a silent mediator encouraging adaptability over rigid control. The galaxy learned a counterintuitive lesson. Chasing perfect understanding was a fool's game. It led to frustration, miscommunication, and eventually walls. The real work happened in the space between knowing and not knowing. The willingness to misunderstand together, to sit in that confusing middle ground and patiently untangle it as a team, that was where true agreements were forged. The most valuable thing a diplomat could bring to the table wasn't a flawless briefing book. It was the patience to be confused and the humility to ask the right questions. Sarah's initial nervousness, once a personal flaw, was now chapter 1 in every training program, the first most important skill to master. So what's the takeaway from all this light and noise? The real breakthroughs never happened because someone followed a protocol manual. They happened when someone decided to care first and negotiate second. Empathy turned out to be the only universal language that mattered. Humanity's greatest export wasn't technology or firepower. It was a simple willingness to be the student, not the teacher. And that messy, imperfect sense of humor? It proved to be the most advanced piece of diplomatic tech in the known universe. A well-timed joke bridges more gaps than a quantum engine.